Hey sailors, welcome to the crew. I'm Sea Lord Janda, and this is Sea Lord Janda's All the World's Fighting Ships 1900. We are going to basically have a nice look through and see what kind of wacky things the world is up to as of 1900 in our Great Britain campaign that's ongoing. Although, obviously, this saves from February 1901, but we're just going to pretend it's not. Um, so, as of now, budget wise, Britain is still on top in the world by a pretty fair margin. That's us, obviously. And the same with fleet tonnage, but Germany, France, Russia, and Italy all a similar amount behind on fleet tonnage. The USA catching up on budget, but not yet on tonnage. Japan low on both budget and tonnage, and Austria, Hungary, and Spain the same. So we went through by category of ship before, and I think we'll do the same here. Destroyers, we are on super large fleets, right? I think. Um, so I'm probably not going to be able to go over every ship in as much detail as in the last All the World's Fighting Ships, because it would take just hours and hours potentially. But we'll see how it goes. So destroyers, there's a lot in service already, less in our fleet than all the other fleets. Their value is questionable. Spain has 44, amounting to 13,200 tons, which is the least tonnage, though not the least numbers. And it appears that they are pretty much all 300-ton ships, 27 knots, one 3-inch gun, two centerline torpedo tubes. Except for some of the latest ones that managed to slap on four 3-inch guns. And that's pretty much what everybody's destroyers are going to look like, I'm fairly sure. Next would be... Let's see, I'm going by tonnage here. Next would be Japan, which has 52 destroyers amounting to 16,300 tons. Just a little more than us by tonnage. And yeah, much the same. All of these classes, 300 tons, 27 knots, one 3-inch gun, two torpedo tubes. Except for this Akabono class, which they shoved four 2-inch guns into, and the Boros recently they got four 3-inch guns into, although apparently at the cost of only 26 knots. Or alternatively, they have some ships that can get up to 28 knots now, but these aren't radical differences. This one is one 3-inch, four 2-inch, but only 26 knots. All of them, I mean, these are very primitive destroyers still. They're not really a mature technology yet in 1900. So that will take us to Austria-Hungary. 53 destroyers, 15,900 tons. A little less than Japan by tonnage, a little more by numbers. I don't know how that works, because they're all 300 tonners, but maybe Japan had more building. Only by one. I don't know how that works. Maybe Japan has a larger one somewhere. Anyway, Austria-Hungary, I mean, they're all 300 tons, 27 knots, one 3-inch, two torpedo tubes, pretty much the standard. They have some more recent ones with one 3-inch, four 2-inch, and some with four 3-inch. But nothing spectacular. Then the USA, 60 destroyers, 18,300 tons. Once again, pretty much all what I'll call the standard destroyer. Actually, they have a lot of these one 3-inch, six 2-inch, but only 25 knot speed destroyers, though some of them are faster. And then some four 3-inch, and most recently some two. Oh, those are corvettes. Never mind. Yes, four 3-inch is the most recent iteration of destroyer for them. Russia, yeah, Russia has 59 destroyers, 18,700 tons. They've got the standard one 3-inch, 28 knots apparently, and then some one 3-inch, six 2-inch with 26 knots. One 3-inch, four 2-inch, 27 knots. And most recently, they've been doing one 3-inch, six 2-inch again, all with the two torpedo tubes. Germany is at 87 destroyers, 27,400 tons, which is the second most in the world, actually. They've got, well, pretty much they started with the standard type, and then they built some with 1 3-inch 6 or 4 2-inch, which apparently didn't cost them any speed at that point. They had a few more and then sort of alternated, it appears, and they've just got a lot built. Most recently, they've been doing just 2-inch 25, oh, 2-inch and 25 knots, but they've been managing to stuff a third torpedo tube on, which is at least a different design, to be fair. Don't know if it's really better, but it's definitely different. And the extra torpedo tube's probably worth more than the extra guns, really, at this point. Let's see. Did I skip Italy or did I go over Italy? No, there's nothing unique about what Italy's building anyway. I can't remember if I went over them or not. But it's pretty typical destroyers. 62 of them, 18,600 tons. And then Russia, France, currently the second largest fleet in the world. 89 destroyers for 27,500 tons, which is the most in the world by numbers and tonnage. And I mean, they started off with the pretty standard design. They built some with 1 3-inch 6 2-inch or 1 3-inch 4 2-inch, and a lot of them only made 26 knots, it appears. They built some that make 29 knots with 1 3-inch, and then they were back to the 4 to 6 2-inch, and then back to just 1 3-inch, and most recently they've built a few with 4 3-inch and 29 knots. They had a few with 2 3-inch, 4 2-inch. And then, of course, we, Britain, actually only have a small destroyer force of 38 ships, 15,400 tons. Albeit ours are started off as 300 tonners with 1 3-inch, 2 2-inch, 26 knots, and 2 torpedo tubes, the Stag class. And then, well, actually, we also apparently have 1 Desperate in commission still with 2 2-inch only, 26 knots. So that's worse. And then just recently, we've built the Flying Fish class with 1 3-inch, 6 2-inch, 27 knots, and the 3rd torpedo tube. So these pretty much compete or are superior to anything the AI has. We just don't have a whole lot of them yet. And torpedoes are still a bit anemic, so that's not necessarily that bad of a thing. Cruisers. There's not a lot of powers with very large protected cruiser forces. There are a lot of armored cruisers around in the world, obviously. Spain has 7 protected cruisers amounting to 28,800 tons, of which 2 5-inch, 10 3-inch. Dismal, not a cruiser. Navarra, 10 6-inch, 8 2-inch, 22 knots, 2-inch belt. That's actually a pretty nice cruiser. Twin turrets and all, even. And on 5,400 tons, so Navarra isn't so bad. Ganesha, 2 8-inch, 6 6-inch. 20 knots, 3-inch belt. Definitely not that bad. I mean, I don't try to stick 8-inch guns on my protected cruisers, preferably, but it's a legacy ship, and I'm pretty sure I have some that are similar, so in fact, I'm sure I do. Castilla, useless, 6 4-inch, 6 2-inch, 20 knots, no. 4 5-inch, 4 4-inch, yeah. Anything that doesn't have 6-inch guns, I consider nigh on worthless. Isabel II, basically similar to Galicia, but more powerful, even with the 10 6-inch, so this is a pretty nice big cruiser. And then Japan, 7 protected cruisers also, 32,500 tons, so a bit heavier. They have Izumi with 2 8-inch, 8 6-inch, and 2-inch belt, 20 knots, a little slow, pretty good. Unebi, 2 8-inch, 6 6-inch, 19 knots is really a little slow. And then they have these 3 Takachihos with 8 5-inch, 8 3-inch, which... See, these would have to be radically faster than all the other cruisers. I mean, several knots faster than all the other cruisers in existence to be worth it. because they do not have the gunpowder to engage any cruiser with 6-inch guns, basically. So this Chiyoda is worth like 2 of those, probably, at least. And it's only moderately heavier, even. And this thing is also garbage. Itsukushima. Then we have... sorry, I'll figure the order out. Austria-Hungary, 9 protected cruisers, 44,200 tons. Those would be Zenta, 4.5-inch, 4.4-inch, garbage. 4 Aspern class, which apparently have 2 10-inch guns on a 4,600-ton cruiser, along with 6 6-inch, 16 2-inch, 2-inch belt, 20 knots. Not that fast, but it's not that horribly slow. Its armor isn't good, but it isn't terrible. 2 10-inch guns is a choice. I mean, in fairness, for something in this weight class, that's a lot of hitting power. If it hits, which it won't most of the time. I certainly wouldn't build it. But it will... It's got the potential to mess up almost any cruiser in existence. It's just that more times than not, I think, something with just 6-inch guns will probably shred it before it actually lands good damaging hits with the 10-inch guns there, but maybe. And then a couple more Zentas, 1 Taurus with 2 8-inch, 6-inch, which is a little more reasonable, but on the other hand, also the 10-inch guns, the extra hitting power is quite considerable there. So, I don't know. If I was going to build something with a couple of bigger guns, maybe I would just go for the much bigger guns, you know? And another Aspern, actually. Then the USA, 9 protected cruisers, 37,500 tons, so a bit less actually. 3 Chicagos with 2 8-inch, 8 6-inch, 10 3-inch, 20 knots. Not that fast, but overall not that bad. I mean, probably the guns are quite outdated even by 1900, but as a basic design, not terrible. But then they ruin it with Olympia with 8 5-inch, 8 3-inch. And 4 San Franciscos with 4 5-inch, 4 4-inch. Dismal. But not as dismal as this with 2 4-inch, 10 3-inch, 8 2-inch. I mean, the best I can say about this is that maybe it's an anti-destroyer ship at that point. But it doesn't really even have the speed to be a good anti-destroyer ship, so... Yeah, I don't know what Chattanooga, USS Chattanooga is doing, but I think dying is probably the best answer to what it's doing. Then that will give us Russia, which has 7 protected cruisers, 30,700 tons, which is really not a lot for their size. They've got Vesta, 2 8-inch, 8 6-inch, kind of slow, but not a terrible armament. Veliki Kinyos Konstantin, 10 6-inch, 8 2-inch, quite reasonable. Boyarin, 4 5-inch, 4 4-inch, that is a destroyer. Rinda, 6 4-inch, 6 2-inch, also the destroyer. And Oprichnik, 10 6-inch, 8 2-inch, 21 knots. Awfully thin belt, but it's a reasonable armament at speed at least. And then Italy, 13 protected cruisers, 53,100 tons. I mean, that's actually puts them 4th, which is where their overall tonnage is, albeit it's still a big gap to the top 3. They've got Tripoli, 4 5-inch, 4 4-inch, terrible. Partenope, 2 8-inch, 10 6-inch, 21 knots. 10 6-inch, 8 2-inch on the Giovanni Bosson. That's probably better in my opinion. Well, it's not objectively better than this, but feels more balanced. I don't know. Degali's only 5-inch guns. Clio, 2 8-inch, 6 6-inch. Still not bad. The Eurydice's just 2 5-inch, 10 3-inch. That is bad. 4 Minervas with 6 4-inch, 6 2-inch. I mean, yeah, so many of the AI cruisers just terminally underarmed, unfortunately. And then we have Germany. 23 protected cruisers for 93,100 tons. You will note that is 5 less ships than me, and my tonnage is 300,000 tons. Okay, I'm building 8. That'll be included in the tonnage, but still. Okay, France, 24 ships, 128,000 tons. Germany's ships are definitely on the small side. They've got 3 Geffions with 6 4-inch, 6 2-inch, only 20 knots. Dismal. 2 Nymphs with 2 5-inch, 10 3-inch, 21 knots. Possibly worse overall. 2 Frauenlobs with 10 6-inch, 8 2-inch. These are at least decent. They make 21 knots and all, so yeah, could be worse. 5 total Geffions with 6 4-inch, 6 2-inch, and only 20 knots. Oh wait, that's added to the 3 previous ones, so they've got 8 of those in all. 2 Ariadnes with 4 5-inch, 4 4-inch, 8 2-inch, only 20 knots. Not good. 4 Lubecs with 2 8-inch, 8 6-inch, 10 3-inch, which would be reasonable, but this only makes 18 knots, which is not enough for a cruiser in any era, really. And then 5 Dresdens with 8 5-inch, 8 3-inch. At least it makes 22 knots, but also only a 1-inch belt, so decent speed, very poor armor and armament. France has the world's second largest protected cruiser fleet, with 24 ships amounting to 124,000 tons. That's a whole bunch, 8 Taga class, 2 8-inch, 8 6-inch, 20 knots, 2-inch belt. I mean, a little slower than I'd like, but not terrible at all. Then 7 Jean Barts with 10 6-inch, 8 2-inch, 21 knots, 2-inch belt. Well, these are just quite decent, I would say. 2 Chasseloup Le Bon, which 4 5-inch, 4 4-inch, and only 19 knots. Dreadful. Le Voisier, which 20 knots is not as good, but still not horrible. I guess it's basically the same as the Tagas. Sorry. Then the Descartes, which went a thin belt, but otherwise similar to the Jean Barts. And the Asses, which I don't even know what the difference between these and the Jean Barts is. They look pretty identical, and should be decent still. So actually, France's fleet overall is pretty nice. They don't have they have a couple, but not a lot of the ridiculously bad light cruisers. So some points for them. We as Britain have 28 ships in service and 8 building, totaling 303,000 tons, which is, by both numbers and especially tonnage, by far the best protected cruiser fleet. Most of it is legacy ships, so I'm not going to claim credit for a lot of it. We have some 7 Argonaut class, no, 8 Argonaut class, which are 9,100 ton ships with 2 9-inch, 12 6-inch, 16 3-inch, 4-inch belt, 2.5-inch deck. They only make 20 knots, which I'd like better out of a modern cruiser, but they are legacy ships. I mean, they're very well armed. I question, sort of, the inclusion of 9-inch guns. I wouldn't actually rate them much worse, and probably could have saved some money and tonnage by having 14 6-inch guns instead, or 16 6-inch guns, if you could get twin turrets. But I mean, the armor is very good. Realistically, the armament for a protected cruiser is very good. The major problem the Argonauts have is that they pretty much cost armored cruiser money, and they're armored cruiser sized. In fact, they're as big or bigger than a lot of our original armored cruisers, although we've since phased those out, but they're still barely any smaller than our armored cruisers. The Andromedas are functionally identical, so that's basically, 9 Argonauts then. Yeah. The Ariadnes are pretty much the alternative, but without the 9-inch guns. 14 6-inch, 9100 tons, 20 knots, 4-inch belt, 2.5-inch deck. Although their implementation of the 6-inch guns as like side by side separate things is not great, so I'm not that impressed by them overly, but they're still pretty much some of the most powerful protected cruisers in the world. And we've got two Creases, which are pretty much the same as the Argonauts, and 5 Abukirs, which are the same as the Ariadnes, and another Argonaut there, an Andromaca, which is also the same as the Ariadnes. And then what we've built so far has been the 7, I think it was originally more, but 7 Terpsichore class, which are intended as line cruisers basically, with 14 6-inch, 8 4-inch, 8,900 tons, 21 knots, 4-inch belt, 2-inch deck. I mean, they are equally, well, actually better armed than this type, slightly faster, similar armor. The only thing is they still have their turrets in this arrangement, which I don't love, but I think twin turrets didn't really work right for some reason. We just maybe don't have the tech to make it work right on ships this size. Or didn't. Don't remember for sure what the imperative upon designing them was, but they're still, I mean, these are unquestionably some of the most powerful protected cruisers in the world, between good speed, excellent armament, excellent armor. They're just very large also still, but that's just kind of how I build ships most of the time. And then most recently we have 2 Sibyls with another 4 building, which are 8 6-inch, 8 4-inch, 21 knots, 2-inch belt, 1.5-inch deck, and these are fitted out with long range and the full colonial service package. 6,500 tons. Honestly, makes them still. These are objectively still bigger and more powerful than most of the rest of the world's frontline protected cruisers. Although there are some that are better in the rest of the world, but there's a lot that aren't. But these are basically just designed to hold down our foreign stations tonnage requirement. They're very well suited for it. And then we're also building 4 Cordelia class, which are the successors to the Terpsichores, and pretty much correct the problems they had. 14 6-inch with the actual twin turret arrangement, 12 4-inch, 22 knots, 3-inch belt, 2-inch deck, 7,800 tons. These, I think, are probably the best protected cruisers in the world, full stop. Especially as they only displace 7,800 tons, which is a lot less than a Terpsichore, so they're much more cost efficient as well. It's just a shame they're not done yet, and there's only 4 of them, but yeah. And so then armored cruisers. Everyone has a lot of armored cruisers. Starting with Spain, who have, actually, we don't even have the biggest force of armored cruisers. We don't even have close to the biggest force of armored cruisers, but we're kind of making up for it with our huge protected cruiser tonnage. But Spain, 118 cruisers amounting to 142,000 tons. We've got Vizcaya, 2 7-inch, 6 5-inch, 8 2-inch, 18 knots, 4-inch belt. Yeah, the 18 knots is particularly dismal in Spain's case, but basically this is probably one of the worst or weakest armored cruiser templates that I see floating around, with the 2 7-inch and 6 5-inch. We'll see more of these from other AI powers, I am certain. They are not good. They don't stand up well, even honestly, to a good 6-inch armed protected cruiser will chew these up pretty well, considering it's just 2 of the 7-inch guns and then the rest are 5 or 2-inch. Yeah, they've got a thicker belt than most protected cruisers, but not even all, and in this particular example, the speed is also dismal, so this thing's pretty much a sitting duck. But any of these 2 7-inch armed ships that don't have a much better secondary package than this are pretty terrible. Then Infanta Maria Teresa, 2 8-inch, 8 6-inch, 12 3-inch, 20 knots, 3.5-inch belt. Not as bad. I prefer either a larger caliber than, like, 9-inch caliber, or bigger, or at least twin turrets or something on armored cruisers, but for a relatively small size, the Infanteria Thereses here are not that bad. Their speed and armor are both a little lacking, but not appalling. Then they have Morphus Chaos. They have 4 of the Cardinal Jimenez de Cisneros, which, okay, 7,000 tons, 4 7-inch with the twin turrets, 8 6-inch, 12 3-inch, 4-inch belt, 20 knots. 20 knots, not great, but not horrible. 4 7-inch is a little on the weak side for my taste, but it's a lot better than 2 7-inch, plus the 8 6-inch, and the belt is good. So this is a reasonably powerful armored cruiser. It's just lacking some of the punch that the bigger and more expensive armored cruisers have. Reina Cristinas, which are basically that, but with an extra 2 6-inch guns. Then 4 Lepantos, which have 6 8-inch guns with side turrets, wing turrets, and 12 5-inch, 10 2-inch, 3-inch belt, 20 knots. I actually think these are worse. I mean, yes, they have the extra 8-inch gun. Well, okay, alright. Different things, really. They might be better because they have 8-inch guns instead of 7-inch. And the 12.5s are not so bad. So I'm not sure these are worse. But I wouldn't go for the wing turrets myself. Just to have the 1 extra gun per side, I think you're sacrificing quite a lot of potential secondaries for that. If you could get 4 8-inch and 12 6-inch, that would be a lot better, in my opinion. For anti-cruiser combat, at least. And then another of these 7-inch types. The 2 7-inch. The Belires. They are building a couple of massive 12,000 tonners in France, so we'll see how that turns out. The Santelmos. Japan. 21 armored cruisers amounting to 148,000 tons. They've got 2 of the 2 7-inch type. Dreadful. 4 Azumas with 2 8-inch, 8 6-inch. 20 knots only, but not bad, just slightly deficient. They've got, what, 7? No. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yes, 7 Kasugas with the 6 8-inch, 12 5-inch loadout. Definitely a little slow, and as I said, I would prefer no wing turrets and better secondaries. They've got 2 Takaos with 2 8, 6 4. These are pretty bad, actually, because between the bad armor and the dismal secondaries, the 2 8-inch guns are not going to cut it for an armored cruiser on their own. And then, what, 6 Atago class? Yeah, 6 Atago class, 4 8-inch, 6 4-inch, 12 3-inch. Weak belt, not great speed. Even the 4 8-inch, I mean, they just need better secondaries for armored cruisers in this era, I would say. And then that will bring us over to Austria-Hungary. 17 armored cruisers, 127,000 tons, which is not a super powerful force. They've got 3 Kaiserin und Königin Maria Theresas, which are the 2886 type. Not terrible, but not great. They've got Adria, which is the 2-7 type. Dreadful. 4 of the Donaus, which are the 4-7, 10-6s. Notably deficient speed and armor, though. Not good. They've got 6 of these Lissas, which are a 6 7-inch, 12 6-inch type. 5-inch belt, 20 knots. The armor is good. The speed is not that bad. Especially with 7-inch guns, even more, I question the wing turrets. Because 7-inch guns are not that much more powerful than 6-inch, as you'd expect. Sorry. So, why even bother? Yeah. I'd rather have 2 extra 6-inch guns than have the 7-inch wing turrets. That's not objectively correct, but I kind of would. Certainly 4 6-inch would be better. But the armor is good, so I'm not going to say it's a terrible class. And then 3 Klagenfurts with another building. These are 6 8-inch, 14 5-inch, 4-inch belt, 20 knots. I mean, these I will definitely say drop the wing turrets, please. 6-inch secondaries, because the secondaries are doing a lot of the work fighting other cruisers at this stage, really. Then the United States, 26 armored cruisers, 193,000 tons. This is actually the most competitive part of their navy, probably. They've got 2 New Yorks, which are the 2886 type. Moderately not great speed and armor. Obviously, it's not spectacular weaponry either, but it's pretty good. So these are not a terrible class at all. Then they've got 4 Brooklyns with 4, 8, 10, 6, 21 knots, 5-inch belt. Well, you know what? These are quite nice. I don't have anything bad to say about them. A good speed, a good armor, a good armament. Not spectacularly good, but quite good, to the point that I can't say anything is wrong with this class exactly, you know? And then 3 Huntingtons, which appear to be pretty much the same, except they've lost a knot of speed for no reason, which makes them just a little bit worse. And then 3, okay, alright. Apparently they're refitting those. 3 Salt Lake Cities, which are much the same again, still losing the knot of speed. 4 Seattles, which are, again, much the same, but without the knot of speed. Oh, and less armor, too, though. Why are their classes getting slowly worse as they go along, is the question, then. Oh, wait, and the Seattles also only have 2 8-inch guns, so they're significantly worse, actually. It's not worth it. Saving 500 tons cannot be worth it. The cost of dropping 2 of the 8-inch guns and 1.5 inches of belt armor and a knot of speed. There's no way it's worth it. And then they went really bad with 4 Houstons, which are the 2 7-inch, 6 5-inch type. Dismal. 4 Indianapolis, which is the 4 7 10 6 type. These aren't as bad, but then you just question why they're even bothering with the 7-inch guns. And then Vincennes here, 8 7 10 6, 22 knots, 4-inch belt. I mean, you know, it's a lot of guns. So the wing turrets kind of work here. Whether they're really better than if you had... I don't actually think this class is probably that much more powerful than a Salt Lake City type. The speed is nice. On paper, it's probably a little bit more powerful than a Salt Lake City type, but I don't know if it's worth the expenditure of 3,500 extra tons, 3,000 extra tons even. You know? So then that will take us to Russia. 15 armored cruisers for 116,000 tons, which is actually the worst in the world. So they're way behind on cruisers as a whole, Russia are. They've been building battleships like crazy, though. That part of the reason for them being behind on cruisers is because they've fought and more or less lost 2 wars with us. Even so, they've been putting a ton of budget into battleships and not enough into cruisers, I would say. They've got 2 Varyags, which are 2886, 20 knots, 3.5-inch belt. These are just not great, not terrible. They've got Oleg, which is 4886, and slightly better belt. Could be faster, but not horrible. They've got 2 Bogatyrs, which is the 2765 type, and they only make 18 knots, so those are sitting ducks. They've got 5 Bayons, which are 4 7 12 6, 19 knots, 5-inch belt. I mean, it's a good belt, it's a good secondary armament. If you could up the guns to 8-inch and give it 1 or 2 more knots of speed, it would actually be a really nice cruiser. As it is, it's a bit mediocre. They've got 2 Kinyagina Olgas, 6,800 tons, 20 knots, 4886, 3.5-inch belt. I mean, the speed and the armor are both not great, but it's not a terrible class by any means. Especially when they've got 4 of these Alexander Nevskys, which with 2765 are a terrible class, although at least they make 20 knots, because I've seen some of these that only make 18. Then we've got Italy, 16 armored cruisers, 117,000 tons. Also, not great for the size of their fleet. They've got Vittor Bassani, which is a 4786 type. You know, not absolutely terrible, but it's a pretty high displacement armored cruiser still, so I mean when you can get 2886 with just a slightly worse belt, yeah. I mean Marco Polo is worse, but I'm not that sold on Vettor Pisani either. However, I'm really not sold on Carlo Alberto, which with 2765 and 18 knots, terrible. Then they've got four. I don't know what's that. It's not that big a number. One, two, three, four. I don't know why I'm having trouble counting it. Four Giuseppe Garibaldi's, 6,800 tons, 21 knots, 4868, 4886, 4-inch belt. A pretty archetypal bog standard armored cruiser, really. Nothing wrong with it. Castelfidardo, 7,600 tons, 6'8", 12.5, 4.5-inch belt. Could have used less primary, more secondary. Really could have used an extra knot or two of speed, so not sold on those. And 5 Strombolis, 6,800 tons, 21 knots, 4 9-inch, 8 6-inch, 12 3-inch, 4-inch belt. Now these are quite nice, actually. I like the 9-inch guns myself. The 8-inch wouldn't have made it drastically. I mean, it's basically similar to the bog standard. Well, not. It's similar to these, but with the 9-inch guns. And they didn't even have to have a tonnage increase, so they're just slightly better than the Garibaldis, really. That little bit of oomph, X factor, you know? Nothing wrong with that. Germany has the most armored cruisers in the world at 29, amounting to 226,000 tons, most by numbers and tonnage. They've got 2 Victoria Louise, which are 2765 and 18 knots, so those are garbage. They've got 3 Herthas, which are 4886, 21 knots, 4-inch belt. Again, basically the default armored cruiser design. Then they've got what? Oh my god, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 of these 2765 ships from 2 different classes, and they all only make 19 knots. Which means they are all garbage. 3 Bluchers, 4, 7, 10, 6, 20 knots, 4-inch belt. These aren't that bad. Not that bad. I'd really prefer to see 8-inch guns myself. But I don't know that it makes a huge practical difference, but I'd just feel better about it. And then another 2765, which is, yeah, terrible. And it still only makes 18 knots. I don't know why so many of the 2765s are extra slow as well, because the last thing ships that are this underarmed need to be is to also be slow. I guess they're just the budget armored cruisers, but they're too budget because the real armored cruisers will just eat them for breakfast and they don't really have a purpose. Obviously they're also, especially in this case, they're much too slow to catch protected cruisers. Nor are they even that winning against a good protected cruiser with 8 6-inch guns would probably have a good chance of killing them. So what the hell is the purpose of this archetype of ship? You know, it doesn't really have anything it's winning against, even in its own weight class. Then the Stuttgarts, 3 of them, 2.8, 10.6, 20 knots, 2.5-inch belt. These are a bit disappointing, really. I mean, could have sprung for 4 8-inch guns, another knot of speed. It's not even well armored, which is supposed to be the German trademark. And then they've got, what, 3, 6, 7 Kohlbergs with the 7,600 tons, 6 8s, 14 5s, 10 2s, 4-inch belt, 19 knots only, though. The guns are not really that great because, again, less primary, more secondary, and then 19 knots is just a bit on the disappointing sides. The Kohlbergs are big, but not that good, in my opinion. And then 3 Stralsunds, which 2.8, 8.5, 22 knots, 2.5-inch belt. I mean, under armored, fast, but not very well armed either, really, so not impressed by those. And they're building 4 giant Graudens class, which, yeah, we've seen in the war, but No spoilers for the war episodes yet, although I just spoiled the war, so, but, I mean, you've seen it happening already, but yeah. Um, I mean, if you're following along in the campaign, at this point you'll have seen the war start, so no real spoilers there. Anyway, France. 27 armored cruisers, 222,000 tons, just behind Germany. They've got 6 Deploy de Lumes, 6 8-inch, 12.5, 3.5-inch belt, 19 knots. As usual, more secondaries, please, and also more speed in this case. Don't like seeing cruisers that don't have at least a 2-0, you know? And then they built 4 Du Petit Trois classes with 2.765s and only 19 knots. Dreadful. 4 Gloires with 2.8, 10.6, 20 knots, 3.5-inch belt. Eh. These are just kind of below average in all regards. And then a whole bunch 3, 4, 7, 9 Victor Hugo class, 2.8, 10.6, 20 knots, 3.5-inch belt. I mean, again, just sort of below average in all regards. Although I don't know if they're actually below the global average, but they feel below average to me. And then they're building 3 12,000-ton Tourvilles, so those ought to be something. Britain, meanwhile, has a relatively modest fleet, honestly, of 18 armored cruisers amounting to 176,000 tons. Although, spoilers, but some of the Argonauts will end up getting converted to armored cruisers pretty soon. But you don't have any legacy ships left. I don't think there were that many to start with. But there's 4, 8 are the Drake class from 1891, 9,800 tons, 4 9-inch, 10 6-inch, 12 3-inch, 21 knots, 4-inch belt, 2-inch deck. So these have sort of the main armament that I think belongs on armored cruisers from this era. If you're going to make them good, with the 4 9-inch guns, could have even more secondaries, but a pretty good secondary and tertiary battery. Speed that I like, armor that I like. They're not that spectacular, but they're pretty good. Obviously, at 9,800 tons, they're quite heavy compared to most of the AI designs, but that, again, is just kind of how I typically build things. And those were followed up more recently by the Berwick class. Also 9,800 tons, 21 knots, 4 9-inch, 10 6-inch, 12 3-inch. The major difference being we freed up enough weight on the 9,800 tons due to various tech improvements to get a 5-inch belt, which makes them quite well armored, as well as any ships in the world, really, as well as well armed and decent speed. So I wouldn't say these armored cruisers are all around spectacular, but they're all fairly good. And finally, that will bring us to the battleships. There are a lot around. The top 4 powers alone have well over 100 pre-dreadnoughts. I'm not sure how many. I can't be bothered to tally the numbers up, but I would guess there's about probably almost 200 in the world altogether. Spain have actually 13 battleships totaling 121,000 tons. Velasco, 412, 10.6, 11-inch belt, 15 knots. Wouldn't be that bad, except that the 12-inch guns are cross-deck firing for some reason. I have no idea what excuse they even have for that. I feel like cross-deck firing is a more advanced technology than just having fore and aft guns. But it's terrifying in a bad way. Stop, Spain. Then 3 Fernando the Sevenths, which have 2 12-inch, 2 11-inch, 15 knots, 11-inch belt. The speed and armor are not great, but not horrible, although the armor is not just pre-crop. It's a legacy ship. The armor is pre any modern compound. It's pre-Harvey as well, so it's going to be much worse than a Krupp 11-inch, but the 212 and 211 in single turrets, I cannot believe is a good use of weight. I think probably you could just get four. Maybe I'm wrong, but I really think you could probably just get 412s using twin turrets on the same or possibly less displacement. So I don't know what the hell they're doing here, but I don't like it. Reina Donna Isabel II, 10-inch belt, 17 knots, 4 10-inch guns. Weirdly light battleship, kind of fast for its era. Small displacement at 9,000 tons, not great armor. Very weak armament for a battleship. I mean, it's about stronger than any armored cruiser, albeit still significantly slower. But mostly in armor. There's some armored cruisers that could about go toe to toe with it gun wise, if not for the armor. So I'm not too convinced. Two Alejandro the Firsts, two 10-inch, four 8-inch, 18 knots 10-inch belt. Well, this thing is almost like a. It's still too slow to be a proto battle cruiser, really, but it's faster than most battleships, but really weakly armed for a battleship. And the armor's not that great. I don't know what its niche is, because it's not fast enough to catch an armored cruiser. Well, except the really terrible ones, but you don't need this to catch the really terrible ones, you just need an armored cruiser. And then three Tridents, four 9-inch, 15 knots, 8-inch belt. Okay. These have officially crossed the line to just being complete garbage. These are effectively equivalently armed to a decent armored cruiser, and equivalently sized, if not smaller. They just are radically slower in exchange for like 3 to 4 inches of belt armor compared to an armored cruiser. And that's not really a good trade off. I wouldn't be that convinced that an armored cruiser couldn't sink this ship. With a bit of luck. And an armored cruiser could certainly choose whether or not to fight this ship and outmaneuver this ship, you know? And then three Intrepidos, which 4 10-inch, 8.5-inch belt, 17 knots. I mean, a slightly less dismal armament, but still pretty dismal for a battleship and pretty dismal armor, too. So, Spain has a lot of pocket battleships, basically, and they're not that good. They rarely are. Japan, 12 battleships for 166,000 tons. The first three, the Fujis, not battleships. Really slow, really weakly armored, and armored cruiser grade armament, basically. The 6-8 inch is a touch, but yeah. I mean, and then they have no really effective anti-destroyer armament, honestly. 10 2-inches. Well, destroyers of this era are pretty vulnerable, so even a couple 2-inch shots will hurt them, but yeah. These are not good battleships. I'm not sure they're battleships. Perhaps they're just coast defense ships. That would be the generous interpretation. Then three Asahis, 4 10-inch, 18 knots, 8-inch belt. These are more along the proto battle cruiser kind of line, where these are really not exactly battleships. They're not really fast enough to actually be proto battle cruisers, but they're faster than the average battleship, only more lightly armed and armored, but I don't think it's worth the trade off. Their armor is not that good. Their guns are really not that good. They don't have full battleship caliber guns either, is the problem, yeah. And then two Sagamis, which are almost much the same, but slower and with a weaker. I mean, they're only 6,000 tons. This is not a battleship on 6,000 tons. It has 4 10-inch guns, yeah. It has barely a better belt than an armored cruiser, and worse speeds, and honestly, worse secondaries, too. So, why? These actually almost are proto battle cruisers with the guns still aren't there, but the armor is there to be a battle cruiser, not really to be. It's a decent compared to what the AI puts on battleships. To be fair, speed is high for a pre-dreadnought. Guns are bad. And most recently, they have Suwo, which is just unequivocally not a battleship. It is, however, a decent armored cruiser. I'm just gonna flat out say it. This is an armored cruiser. It has the speed of an armored cruiser. It has the armor of a very good armored cruiser. And it has the armament of a pretty average armored cruiser. I don't see any criteria by which this is a battleship. It's just an armored cruiser. And a pretty damn good one for 6,400 tons, honestly. But it's not a battleship. At all. I don't even dislike it. If it was an armored cruiser, I would say it was good. But as a battleship, no. Austria-Hungary, 20 battleships, 184,000 tons. 4 Kaisers, 3 12-inch guns with 2 of them in separate 4 mounts. 6 6-inch, 16 knots, 9-inch belt. Armor, I mean, I've seen worse, but it's bad. Guns are just basically plain old weird. On 5,400 tons, it could be worse, honestly, but I would say it's more of a monitor than a battleship. 3 Monarchs with 4 10-inch, 16 knots, 10-inch belt. I mean, these are better balanced, but not necessarily better. The 10-inch gun downgrade is quite substantial for just slightly better armor and speed. Zrini appears to be pretty much the same as the Monarchs. They got 2 Babenbergs, which have 4 9-inch, 6 6-inch, 17 knots, 8.5-inch belt. I mean, armament, not great. Armament is quite poor. It's armored cruiser grade armament. It's like half battleship grade armor. It's like slightly faster than average battleship speed. I don't know what it's trying to be, but it's having an identity crisis, is what it's having. There's their whole Karl, 4 10-inch, 8.5-inch belt, 16 knots. It's just a bad battleship. It doesn't have enough speed that it can be pretending to be an armored cruiser or anything. But it's got 2 small main guns, inadequate secondaries, and 2 little armor. It's just a bad, small battleship. And then they have 5, 6, 7 Tegetoffs, which are pretty much the same and are also just bad, small battleships. Thing is, with the 4 10-inch, they're not even going to really stand up to a 12-inch armed battleship. They don't have the armor or the armament to stand up effectively to a 12-inch gun battleship. So I don't know what their purpose is. Well, their purpose is probably denial of the Adriatic to armored cruisers. They can't actually catch armored cruisers, but just by patrolling the Adriatic in sufficient numbers, they can sort of deny it to them. Maybe. Could be the arguable purpose. And they would do that reasonably well, but they wouldn't fare well against an actual line of battle. The USA, 18 battleships, 184,000 tons. Very similar tonnage to Austria-Hungary, slightly less hulls. They've got 4 Delawares, 4 10-inch, 13 knots, and an 11-inch belt. I will be generous and say that this is an alright coast defense ship on 6,600 tons. It does not have the guns to be a battleship, and frankly, it does not have the speed to stand with any battle line. It does, however, have pretty alright armor. So, coast defense ship, maybe. Then they have 7 Montana class, which 4 10-inch, 6 6-inch, 7,700 tons, 17 knots, 9-inch belt. I mean, the armament and armor are still dreadful. The speed is better than necessary, so this is almost... I wouldn't quite say it's playing at being an armored cruiser, but it's just not a good battleship either. The 12-inch battleship would be much nicer. And then they have 3, 4, 7 Wyomings with another one building. And these 4 12-inch, 8.4, 16 knots, 8-inch belt. I mean, These have finally got the armament of a battleship, but they really don't have the armor of a battleship, so 1 out of 2 is a step in the right direction, but they're still a little fragile. Maybe the Kentuckies at 12,000 tons will finally fix that. I don't know. Then we have Russia. Russia has the biggest battle fleet in the world. Now, their cruiser forces suffered terribly for it, but they have the biggest battle line in the world at 33 battleships amounting to 444,000 tons, counting the 6 that are building, so that'll put them at 39 battleships. They've got 4 Imperator Peter Velikis, 6 12-inch guns, 12,000 tons, 16 knots, 12-inch belt. These ships would probably benefit greatly from pulling off one of these weird side-by-side 12-inch turrets and adding a lot more secondaries. That being said, they're not even close to the worst battleships I've seen. They've actually got the armament, the armor, and the speed of a pre-dreadnought battleship. It's just, this is obviously wasted tonnage here. Like, no, stop this. But I've still seen worse. They've got, oh, and then they built 3 more of those. So they actually have 7 of those. They've got 3 Imperator Alexander. Okay, hold on. I don't know, Imperator Alexander something. The 3rd, maybe, or is it the 1st? I can't remember which one they use as a name, but 9,200 tons, 16 knots, 2 12-inch guns, and a 4-turret 12-inch belt. Their armor is good still. The lines of the ship are hilariously stubby. The 1 turret is great. If they could only have fit a 2nd turret and some decent secondaries on, it would have been fine. But as it is, it's grossly underarmed, so it's not actually very good at all. They've got 2 Pobetas, 8,800 tons, 17 knots, 4 12-inch, but only 4 6-inch, 12-2, and an 8-inch belt. So primaries and speed are fine. Armor is mediocre to bad, and secondaries are quite bad. Kinyel's Potemkin, a one-off. 4 12s, 8 6s, 16 knots, 12.5-inch belt. You know? The only thing this is lacking is arguably an even more powerful secondary armament, but I don't have anything to really criticize. This is quite a nice battleship, actually. A pretty standard pre-dreadnought, and not a bad one at all. Then 4 Poltavas, 4 12s, 8 4s, 12,000 tons, 16 knots, 10.5-inch belt. Okay, I'm not sure how after Kinyel's Potemkin, which was also 12,000 tons, they suddenly get so much less out of 12,000 tons, because this ship, for no increase in speed or any other change I can see, has 2 inches less of belt armor and drastically worse secondaries and tertiaries. Now, maybe this ship is cramped and short-ranged or something, and that's the only way they pulled that off on 12,000 tons. But from my perspective, at least, Poltavas are just worse in every way. That being said, they're still not that horrible. It's just their armor is still not that bad. It's just worse, and their secondaries are pretty bad now, though. Then they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 of the Imperator Alexander, whatever this class, Imperator Alexander the Third. So I guess the other ones are the firsts. 12,000 tons, 15 knots, 4 12s, 8 4s, 11-inch belt. They're slower as well now for some reason. Still a decent armament. I think they traded a knot for half an inch of belt, or traded a knot for half an inch of belt basically compared to the Poltavas, which does not make them better. You shouldn't trade a whole knot of speed for half an inch of belt most of the time, and this is not an exception, I don't think. I think these are just worse. Not that terrible still, but just worse. Then Kunyel's Suvorov, 4 10-inch, 18 knots, 9-inch belt. This is one of those classes that's almost playing at being an armored cruiser of sorts, or a proto-battle cruiser. It's, faster than it needs to be for its era, but not even close to well enough armed and not that well armored. And then 5, Andrei Pervolzvanys of 11,900 tons, 412s, 8.4s, 17 knots, 10.5-inch belt. I mean, again, just the belt and the secondaries both are not really what you'd want them to be. But at least they've got 4 12-inch guns on almost all their battleships, which is a big step up from most of the other powers. And then Imperator Pavel I, 4 12s, 4 6s, 19 knots, 7-inch belt. Okay, this one is very much playing it being a proto battlecruiser. It's just not. These 4 inaccurate early 12s and not that much secondary armament. It's just, there's a reason proto battlecruisers, they don't usually work that well. I mean, armored cruisers are the better choice than battleships for playing that role as well. It's not going to stand up well against other battleships with better secondaries and better belts, just because it's got the speed. And it's still not fast enough to keep up with decent armored cruisers, so yeah. Italy. 29 battleships of 380,000 tons. They have 4 Caio Duilios and an Andrea Doria, which 12,100 tons, 16 knots, 4 15-inch guns, 2.6, 4.5, and a 14-inch belt. Look, the obvious problem is that the 15-inch guns are for some reason arrayed in a cross-deck format. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say, look, the speed is fine. The armor is outstanding, although it's going to be an old model armor, but design-wise it's good. The guns sound good, and they will hit very hard, but honestly, navies have enough trouble getting 12-inch guns to work right in 1890. I am guessing these are like -3 quality or something, probably. I doubt they work very well as 15-inch guns. Maybe not, but yeah. And in any case, it has no secondaries. Between the layout and the total lack of secondaries, I'm not confident that this ship is very combat effective in terms of actually doing any damage to anything. The Andrea Doria here trades a lot of belt for some extra secondaries and speed. I don't actually know that that is worth it, but it probably does have a better chance of actually damaging something, so maybe. And then this one, though, well, this one has just made some slightly wrong choices. Ray Umberto, 4 12-inch, 10.7, 10.4, 20 knots, 7-inch belt. If the armament is great, honestly, is quite good. If they had just, why does it make 20 knots? And yet almost this is like a working proto battlecruiser, you know? But that speed is actually enough to keep up with a lot of armored cruisers and some protected cruisers. And its armament and belt are still going to be better than them, so this is almost a working proto battlecruiser. However, against battleships that it's going to be paired against, and in game, because there's no battlecruiser class at this era, it's going to suffer from its lack of belt armor more than it's going to benefit from its speed, because most of the time it's just going to be held back by other battleships' speeds anyway. But I like the design, actually. I don't think it's that bad. Then we have 5 and then they built 4 more of the Re Umberto, by the way. And then 5 Italia class, 11,900 tons, 15 knots, 4 12s, 8 8s, and a 6-inch belt. Okay, look, I don't know what this is playing at. It's obviously a massive secondary armament, and 16 4s is a pretty strong tertiary armament, too. Speed is not that bad, not good either, but the armor is so low. So, I mean, this is a glass cannon kind of ship. The problem is, okay, yes, it's got 4 12s, but to get the full effectiveness out of this thing, you're certainly going to want to be within 8-inch gun range. And really, you're probably going to want to be within 4-inch gun range even, but certainly within 8-inch gun range. And at that point, the belt is really gonna be suffering. If you're gonna build a ship like this, build it. If you gotta sacrifice something, probably sacrifice speed. And just have a tough armor layer and, really slug it out if anything wants to come at you. The lack of belt, I mean, it's very much a glass cannon, let's put it that way. If it doesn't cripple whatever it's fighting very quickly, it's gonna get crippled itself. Not enough armor for a battleship. And then they have 7 Amaraglio Saint Bons, 10,800 tons, 16 knots, or 18 knots, 4 10-inch, 8 6-inch, 11-inch belt. Armor is fine, speed is good, armament is inadequate for a battleship, really. This is more like it's not an unsuccessful battlecruiser, it's just a slightly fast battleship that doesn't really have a good armament for some reason. Like, you would be much better off taking off the 2 knots and getting some 12-inch guns and maybe like 7 or 8-inch secondaries. And then with that amount of armor, it would be great. 2 Cristoforo Colombos, which 410, 6.6, 18 knots, 8.5-inch belt. This one's just all around bad. It's also very small, so that is why, but this one is playing it being an armored cruiser, basically. Identity crisis problem. 5 Littorios. 14,900 tons, 16 knots. 4 13-inch, 10 7-inch, 14 2-inch, 10-inch belt. Armor could be a little better, but not terrible compared to what I see on a lot of AI designs. Armament is quite nice. Speed is good, so I would say this is a very nice battleship class overall, actually. No problems with the Littorios. And then, that'll take us over to the big 3. Germany, 26 battleships, 326,000 tons, which is actually the 5th largest battleship force in the world by tonnage. They've got 4 of this Brandenburg class altogether. 5,300 tons, 14 knots, 2 10-inch, 6 9-inch, and a 7-inch belt, and the 10-inch are in 1-4 turret. It's terrible. It's not a battleship. It's too slow, it's too poorly armored, and it's too poorly armed. It is well enough armed to take on an armored cruiser, which is pretty decent for 5,300 tons. However, it's way too slow to actually bring one to battle, and its armor is not really enough better than one that it would actually be sure of beating some of the armored cruisers out there. I don't really know what... I mean, coast defense ship is at best the role of this thing. This is not a battleship. Full stop, really. It is, however, still better than the 2 Wittelsbachs, which had 7,100 tons, 14 knots, 2 10-inch, 4 9-inch, 8 2-inch, and a 10-inch belt. At least they have armor. And they have hitting... You know what? Maybe it's not better than the Wittelsbachs. Because with the armor, the Wittelsbachs are actually just like dangerous coast defense monitors or something. They're still awfully slow and undergunned to be in a battle line. But they're powerful enough that they present a threat to anything trying to raid your coastline. But that's not really how the game is ever going to use them, so I don't think they're a good class in that regard at all. Then they've got 2 Schwabens, 12,000 tons, 18 nuts, 4 10-inch, 12.5, 9.5-inch belt. Look, speed is great. Armor is mediocre. Armament is just inadequate, frankly. It's just not as good as it should be. I would way rather take the 2 knots off and get 12-inch guns. Especially because a battleship, I mean, a cruiser that has unusually high speed is more likely to find itself in an independent action. A battleship, they have tons of other battleships that only make 16 or 17 knots. It kind of looks like they've actually gone for a 17 knot battle line, but that just means that there's still no need for that extra knot. You would have been better off at 17 and get more armament. You've got to think about these things. You have to think about a standard battle line speed when you're building battleships. The AI pretty much never does, and that's one of its biggest problems, unfortunately. Because it's got a lot of battleships that have speeds that are just totally wasted because they're operating in a battle line with other battleships that don't go that speed. Braunschweig's 11,700 tons, 16 knots, 4 9-inch, 14.6 9-inch belt. Speed is fine, armor is mediocre. Armament is positively anemic for a battleship. Great for an armored cruiser, but for something that's almost 12,000 tons and is classed as a battleship, it is not good enough. There is just no way that 4 9-inch guns is good enough for a battleship. Sorry. Sorry, Germany. 3 Preußens, 12,000 tons, 17 knots, 4 10-inch, 14.5, 8.5-inch belt. I mean, good speed, but poor armor, very poor armament. They don't have the primary caliber, and they really don't have the secondaries. They have a good, like, anti-destroyer secondary, but not an anti-cruiser secondary, really. To the point that a couple of armored cruisers could potentially beat up on these battleships. By virtue of having large numbers of 6 or 7-inch guns that could chew through the armor at close range, and you'd not be likely enough to actually get hits with the 10 inches in this era to make a difference. Then 7 of the Deutschland class, 10,800 tons, 17 knots, 4 11-inch, 8 4-inch, 8 3-inch, 10-inch belt. These are basically balanced, just a little on the fast side, but they're just small and weak. They don't have very good secondaries, tertiaries. Their main armament's just that inch smaller than is the average. Their armor's just not terrible, but not great. You can't necessarily say there's an obvious big flaw or that they're horrible battleships, but they're just definitely smaller and weaker than you would really want or is average. 1 Westfalen, 1 off, 9,100 tons, 17 knots, 4 10-inch, 6.6, 9-inch belt. You know, they've crammed a lot into 9,100 tons, but also, I mean, I don't quite know what it's playing at. It's too slow to be anything but a battleship. But it really doesn't have the armament of a battleship. And its armor is kind of mediocre. For 9,100 tons, I'm actually almost kind of impressed at what they've crammed into here. It's just that it's still not good enough, really, is it? I mean, for 9,100 tons, it's good, but for a battleship, it isn't good, is the end of the story there, basically. And then 5 Ostfrieslands with 3 more building. These are 10,900 tons, 17 knots, 4 10-inch, 10 6-inch, 11-inch belt. Look, good armor, pretty alright, mediocre secondaries, honestly, and a very weak main armament, really. Good speed, though. They actually almost have a 17 knot standardized battle line. It's just kind of why. I don't see that it actually gives much practical advantage over a 16 knot battle line. I mean, it is a little bit of an advantage, but. And even a small speed advantage can add up in a battle, but. It seems like they've sacrificed a lot of gunpowder in particular for it, which is just. Well, typically Germany's supposed to sacrifice gunpowder for armor, but I don't think their armor is actually that spectacular. I mean, this is good, but it's not like obscenely good. I guess compared to what a lot of the other AI designs are, it's quite good though, yeah. France. 25 battleships, 375,000 tons, which is actually 4th in the world. In fact, Germany's 5th in the world. France is 4th in the world behind Britain, Russia, Britain, and Italy, narrowly. They've got 2 Brennis with 3 14s, 12 5s, 15 knots, 16-inch belt. Crazy belt. Speed is not that bad. Secondaries are not really good, but I've seen worse. The guns, I don't know about that. I mean, they're very large caliber, but the secondary, one of them is a midships in a weird position. I'm not really sure 314s laid out like this are going to be better than 412s, and same thing with the Italian 15s. These are probably really, really bad quality. But theoretically, the hitting power on this is quite a lot. They then built no less than, good grief, 4, 8 Carnos? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, yeah, 8 Carno class. 10,100 tons, 16 ounce, 2 13-inch, 2 11-inch, 13-inch belt. Look, the speed is good. The armor is great. The secondaries are not great, but could be worse. However, I just kind of hate this 4 turret layout. I really find it hard to believe that this is possibly better than just having. I'm pretty sure, as I've said before, I really think you can get 4 13-inch guns and 2 twin turrets for less tonnage than you can get 2 13-inch and 2 11-inch. And even if you can't, I would just rather have 4 12-inch and 2 twin turrets. Well, I mean, you've effectively got 3 guns to a side in this arrangement. So that's a clear-cut disadvantage even aside from the weight problems. Then 2 patries, which are 13,700 tons, 19 knots, 3 12s, 1 twin and 1 single turret, 4 8s in twin wing turrets, 8 6s, and 11-inch belt. You know, weirdly, this is a pretty powerful battleship, and yet it's one so weird that they didn't just go with a second twin turret, surely. Like, why just have one less gun than all the 4 12-inch battleships out there? And then, well, the second, I like the 8-inch, but there's not a lot of 8-inch secondaries, really. Nor are there actually that many 6-inch tertiaries, but to be fair, it's a lot better than some of the armaments I've seen. Then again, they don't really have any anti-destroyer caliber secondaries at all. The speed is quite impressive, though, and will... not enough to help against destroyers, though, but enough that this thing could be quite formidable to a lot of the cruisers out there, potentially. I don't hate it, but I think it's weird and obviously flawed, but that's very French of them. Then 5 Libertés, 13,600 tons, 18 knots, 2 12s and single turrets now, 4 8s, 8 6s, and an 11-inch belt. I mean, this is basically similar to the Patries, but a knot slower and 1 less gun. Which actually seems like a hell of a lot to lose for being 100 tons less. A knot and a main gun? I don't see that there's anything else changed or improved, so seems like a bit of a big loss from the Patrice for 100 tons, really. Then 3, 5 Suffrans, 12,100 tons, 18 knots, 2 12s, 4 8s, 8 5s, 11.5-inch belt. Well, I mean, compared to the Libertés, what? Same armament? 2 12, 4 8. No. 5s instead of 6s for the tertiaries. Half an inch extra of belt armor. And 1,500 tons lighter, which I do like 1,500 tons lighter. Is that really the cost for the extra half inch of belt armor? Well, yes, probably to get half an inch more of belt armor while dropping 1,500 tons, they had to swap away the 6s. And it does give an anti-destroyer armament, so I don't know. But at this point, the thing is that 2 12s was already bad, so they were kind of getting a pass on the basis of having a lot of secondary, and they don't really at this point, so I don't know. It's weird, and it's French, and I don't think it's that good. But it's not the worst I've seen, and it's definitely something. And then 3 Voltaire class with 2 more building. 10,500 tons, 18 knots, 4 10s, 8 6s, 8 3s, 10-inch belt. Look, it's still fast. It's still not that badly armored, although worse. The armament, however, is now just... to be fair, 4 10s versus 2 12s. I don't know that it's that much worse, but the caliber drop makes it more obvious. It's not really very well armed, is it? So I'm not in love with the Voltaires. They are building 2 more of those, and they're building, 5 Flanders and the Lorraine, which is bigger, so we'll see how those turn out. And finally, that brings us on to Great Britain, which actually has quite a few battleship, well, not that many battleship classes. We have 1 class of legacy ships, the Collingwoods, of which we have 4, 8, 12 in service still, it appears. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Yeah, 12 Collingwoods still in service. 12,500 tons, 16 knots, 4 13-inch, 6.5, 8.2, 14-inch belt, 2.5-inch deck. I mean, I didn't design these, so I'll feel free to criticize them. Their speed is fine. Their armor is actually outstanding. Quite excellent. Although it's an older compound, which means it's not really as good as that anymore. But it was good when designed, and on paper is good. The main armament is also not bad. The main flaw of these ships is very obviously the weak secondary armament, which is really not... It's alright for anti-destroyer work, it's not good for anti-cruiser work. Unless the Collingwoods hit with their 13-inch guns, they're not going to be much good against cruisers. That said, their belt is so damn thick that most cruisers will have a hell of a lot of trouble damaging them in any noticeable way anyway, so... Could be worse. There's a reason I've kept them around, but whoopsies. Could be better, too. Our next class, 1891, ended up just being 3 ships. The Hannibals, 15,000 tons, 17 knots, 4 13-inch, 10.6, 14.2, 10.5-inch belt, 2.5-inch deck. Did I design these? I don't think I did, maybe. I think these were... The first of these were under construction already. But maybe I did. They don't really look quite like I would design them, but... Their speed is good, probably better than is needed. Their armor is not that good. Their armament, main is fine. Secondaries are a lot better than the Collingwoods, but still not that great, so... I don't actually like the Hannibals that much. For how much they displace, they should have better armor. Less speed, better armor, probably better secondaries too, honestly. Not that they're as terrible as some of the other designs I've seen around, but I'm not overly impressed by them. Then 1894 I built 8 illustrious class battleships, and these I'm sure I did design. 18,800 tons. We pushed it up to 18 knots for a sort of fast standard pre-dreadnought speed. 4 12s, 14 6s, 23s, 11-inch belt, 2.5-inch deck. They are fast, faster than average, and that was an intentional choice. And I've built all the later gen pre-dreadnoughts, which is 2 classes, to that standard so that they would have more longevity. Their main armament is good. Their secondary armament is very respectable, and their tertiary armament is actually excellent. It could be even heavier secondary armament with 7s or 8s, but compared to a lot of the other battleships around there, 6s is not so bad. Armor could be even better, but isn't terrible. At least it's battleship grade armor. And then most recently, we've built 6 London class 1897 up to 1900. These are 17,500 tons, 18 knots, 412, 14.6, 23, and they corrected the major flaw of the illustrious class with a 14-inch belt and 2.5-inch deck. These are really quite nice. They're fast. They're very well armored. They're well armed. They could have an even heavier secondary armament, and that's what we're going to do with our final pre-dreadnought class, I believe. I hardly even remember now. I already designed it, but I can't remember entirely. But I believe heavier secondary armament is the way to go for final generation pre-dreadnoughts. But these are already realistically as good or better than any of the other pre-dreadnoughts in the world at this point. And that brings us to the end of the tour for 1900. Hope you all enjoyed. I'll be back in 1910 with another All the World's Fighting Ships. Thank you all for watching. Remember to like and subscribe. This is Sea Lord Janda, signing off.